Hey, Carlos.
I can't remember whether you're a sports fan or not. Are you a sports fan or not yet?
What, you mean at 55 there's still a chance for me to become a sports fan? Yeah, right. I make a kind of tepid effort to know about my kids' teams when it comes to the Premier League, but that's it.
Well, I have to, when in healthier times, I'm going to have to take you to a basketball game, and you might get swept up in what they call March Madness. So we'll see if that does it.
I've been here 20 years and it hasn't happened yet, so let's try.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
And welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
our new podcast from the BBC World Service and OZY Media.
Yeah, so Carlos, this week I have spent too much of my life listening to the Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, being grilled by senators with, frankly, not much daylight coming out of it. And I just kind of wonder whether the wise American public looks at that and says, guys, please could you be getting on with helping us because we are hurting and we need congressional assistance with this COVID pandemic, and please hand over some money and could you do your jobs, rather than confirming a nominee. I mean, that may be me imbibing a little bit of Democratic propaganda there, actually. But I do wonder whether this is the priority and whether people wouldn't rather be talking about a stimulus bill.
I certainly think that there are a lot of people who are hurting. And I think that there was some sense with the first stimulus bill that some help came early. And so I think in a way, I think people for a moment maybe because the next stimulus didn't happen. I think people may have forgotten it, but it certainly has come back up in conversation. And the other piece of it, to me, that's striking is this stock market piece. The stock market, in many ways, has swooned at the beginning of the pandemic and then has seemed to go on a tear. And that has been interesting, including, I think, a number of young people. I think there's an interesting generational piece to that, Katty, where I think a lot of young people who are home, who have time, have done more day trading than they did before and have made a little more income than they otherwise would have made, driving Uber or doing Airbnb. And I think that's one of the other things that will end up reshaping whatever economy we have going into 2021 as well.
Oh
that may be a different kind of side hustle.
I'm laughing because my 26-year-old son, Felix, literally did that with, I think, disastrous outcomes during the pandemic. He kind of took, he only had about, $50, but he took $50 and bet it on some commodity that then completely crashed. And at one point, do you remember when the oil price went negative? He looked at me seriously and said, could we buy a whole load of oil and store it in the backyard? So I think he should stick to his job as a camera operator, not as a financial trader. Just saying. But I think that the great and wise American public would occasionally be forgiven for thinking we are going to fire the lot of them up on Capitol Hill, because the one thing we really need right now is a little bit of financial help. Not massive amounts, but we need some. We need some financial help. And everyone's just gone, right, we're not going to touch it anymore. And this is equally from the left and the right. But they've dropped the ball on this one. Anyway, they are not talking about it on Capitol Hill, but we are talking about it.
This week, we're taking a look at what the pandemic shows us about American capitalism, how so many people in the richest nation on earth can live on the edge of poverty.
Governments around the world, of course, were caught off guard by the pandemic of 2020, and their responses to this virus varied a lot. Here in America, Congress passed what was called the CARES Act back in March. It was a $2 trillion bill, which, among other things, authorized a direct payment to most Americans, about $1,200 per adult, additional unemployment benefits, and a whole host of loan programs as well. But many of those initiatives, they've expired, or they're going to do so by the end of this year. And Congress, it's just been too stuck to try to renew them.
That inactivity matters. In fact, 2 new studies show that the number of poor people in the U.S. grew by millions in the last few months. And in fact, poverty rates were particularly high for Black and Latino Americans, and unfortunately for children as well.
Okay, and so here's the contrast. In Germany, they've got this program called Kurzarbeit, a policy that's been around for decades, and it's designed to kick in during this kind of an economic shock.
We're going to listen now to two business owners, one in Las Vegas, the other's in Germany. Government actions have affected not only their incomes, but also their employees.
I am Randy Reed. I'm a small business owner, and I am a very concerned citizen right now. We're currently seeing the effects of COVID across the country, and I happen to live in Nevada, which is one of the hardest hit areas. Obviously, we're driven by hospitality, but we also have a lot of small businesses here, mine included. I've had to lay off 80% of my staff. Our business is down, I'd say 85 to 90%. Obviously, we see other countries where they've gone on a minimal shutdown, and if they were completely shut down, they were fortunate enough to have their governments looking out for them and support small businesses. And we're not seeing that really here. For those little guys and gals like myself, I mean, my husband and I have a very small manufacturing company. You know, it's a big deal to us, but it doesn't seem as if we're a big deal to our current government. And I think that that needs to change.
My name is Andreas Hettich. I'm the fourth generation running the family business Hettich. We are one of the largest producers of furniture fittings and hardware. The lockdown, especially in middle of March, took us really by surprise. In the beginning, it was very, very scary, and really we thought about how to survive. The German government implemented some really helpful schemes. First of all, it is the Kurzarbeit, which is this kind of program we already have for decades, but they even made it much easier to apply for it. It's very flexible, and in the end, it means that the people on short-term work or Kurzarbeit, they will be paid for the time they are not working, and they get 60% of their net income from the government, or even 67% of their net income if they have children. This makes it possible for us that we avoid layoffs, which means also the mood is better and they are still spending some money. So this gives a lot of stability.
This program has been so copied by so many other governments that some people call it one of Germany's most successful exports. But for now, at least, it's not likely to be adopted in the U.S.
Yeah, you've heard of Mercedes and BMW. Add Kurzarbeit to your list of German successful exports. And it's a shame it's not going to be adopted here in America, because a lot of people would really like it. So, if they're not going to get that, what could or should be done to help alleviate the economic hardship that so many people are facing here? We have two guests to talk about that with us. The first is Stephanie Kelton. She's a professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University in New York, and she was an advisor to Bernie Sanders when he was running for the presidency. She has recently stepped into the spotlight as an evangelist of an economic school of thought called modern monetary theory. She's written a book about it called The Deficit Myth: Modern Monetary Theory and How to Build a Better Economy. We're going to hear more about that theory a little bit later, but I wanted to start our conversation by asking something different, something that I've observed as an outsider who lives in America. I've lived in lots of different countries around the world, and one thing that always strikes me about the US is that it hasn't really got a strong social safety net. So what is it about Americans or America that makes it so hard to say we need a government-funded safety net that's more robust?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, it isn't that we don't have a safety net per se. It's that it has become so frayed over time that it does very little today compared to what it once did for people when they fall on hard times. So when it comes to fixing those sorts of problems, you're just talking about, in terms of public policy, what are the things that policymakers can do to weave more threading into that safety net, to shore it up, to strengthen it, to catch people before they fall to such lows, to safeguard families and communities for longer periods of time. So much of what we've done over the course of the last, say, 30 years is to undermine the social safety net, to cripple it, to cut holes in it so that more and more people fall through.
Stephanie, one of the things that Katty and I have been talking a lot about is how the situation here in the U.S. compares to other parts of the world. When you see what's happening and what we're struggling with here in terms of poverty, how does that compare to what is happening in the COVID environments in other parts of the world? And how do you think about our response?
Well, I guess it depends a lot on the specific country that we're looking at. I mean, the response to the health pandemic itself, it seems to me, really does help to explain why here in the U.S. things are so much worse than they are in much of Europe, in places like New Zealand, even Australia. We did not handle the virus itself well. And so we're paying a heavier price for that reason. And it doesn't look like Congress can get its act together and get an extra relief bill passed. And we know what the consequences of inaction are going to be. It's going to mean more unemployment. It's going to be more people falling into poverty. It's just that where we are today seems to suggest that we're going to fall well behind many other countries in the world who had both a better response to the virus and a better economic response as well.
We're also joined by someone who has a very personal perspective on financial hardship here in the U.S. Teva Sienicki is the CEO of Metro Caring, a food bank in Denver. 75,000 people rely on Metro Caring for free food. Now, that number may surprise people who look at the U.S. from the outside and are surprised to know that there's that level of need.
Teva, who comes to Metro Caring, your organization, saying they can't feed themselves and they need help?
Well, by and large, it's working families. So parents who are working full-time or more, who are working in retail or the service sector and restaurants, sometimes small business owners, who are just not making sufficient wages to put food on the table, a roof over their heads, and pay for things like healthcare and transportation. And as shocking as it may sound, in the richest country in the world, this story that we see in our community here in Denver is not unusual in the U.S. And really across the country, wages have not kept pace with the cost of living for the last several decades. So what we see at Metro Caring is parents working full time, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs, not able to afford rents.
Teva, had things changed significantly as a result of COVID and the recession? I mean, my expectation is it would. My expectation is that you would see more people in need of help. But you give us the color on that. Has it been a little bit more, a lot of bit more? Are there different kinds of people turning to you for help?
For sure, it's gotten far worse. And I'm going to say that I've been in this sector through 2 previous recessions, and I've never seen anything like this. Each one, it's getting worse and worse. And now with COVID, 1 in 3 Coloradans is food insecure. 1 in 3 is unable to know that they have sufficient food in their refrigerator or in their cupboard to get through the month, or has skipped a meal in the last month, or otherwise eaten things that are insufficient for their nutritional needs just to fill their caloric needs.
You've known this experience yourself, Teva, growing up, what it's like to not have enough food in this country.
I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and my mom was very young when she had me. She was 19, and she was working in a hardware store. My father was in the military, and my brother came pretty shortly after me, and we did have a lot of years where it was hard for my parents to make ends meet. Things were a little bit better then, however. My parents were able to go back to school, and my mom ultimately became a teacher, and my dad became a lawyer. And we had that kind of classic American dream story. So that by the time I was in high school, we were solidly middle class. But what I know and kind of seeing the realities and hearing the stories of families who are coming through Metro Caring today and in previous communities I've worked in prior to this, is that reality, that story is much less common. It's much more difficult to achieve social mobility. If you're born into the bottom 20% in the U.S. today, your chances of working your way up the way my parents did are extremely difficult, and the chances are quite low.
Teva, talk a little bit about the racial element there, because I know that there are listeners out there or people who've experienced the American economy who would say that there never really was a robust American dream for many Black Americans and Brown Americans. And so is that been your experience there in Denver? And is there a racial or gender dimension to it that's worth understanding and noting?
Absolutely. I think understanding racial inequality in the U.S. is a key part of understanding this puzzle. What we know is that if you look at things like the racial wealth gap, the average white family has 1,000 times the wealth of the average Black family in this country. That wealth represents the ability to absorb the ups and downs of life, which are inevitable. So things like when I went through a divorce, or when I had a child that was in the neonatal intensive care, I was able to absorb those because as a family we had some wealth, and I was able to lean on my parents. And that kind of generational wealth has never existed in communities of color because of systems that we created intentionally to cut them out. Because of things like discriminatory lending practices, that has been a persistent problem. So while we may have, had the Civil Rights Act in the late 60s, we still have a long way to go in this country in terms of building a system that is truly inclusive and where we've repaired the harm that we've done and placing the starting lines so far behind for many communities of color.
Stephanie, I know that you have been a cutting-edge economist, and I think someone wonderfully called you the mother of modern monetary theory, but not everyone agrees with that. Would you, for those who don't know what we mean by modern monetary theory, would you kind of succinctly describe what it is?
Well, Carlos, that's a lot to wrap your arms around in a quick description, but here it is. The basic idea is that governments like the U.S., with what we call a modern, this is where the word modern comes into play, a modern fiat currency. In other words, we are not on a gold standard any longer. And so when people talk about safety net programs and other public programs, the question is often, well, but they're so expensive, right? It would cost so much to rebuild the safety net or to employ people or whatever. How are we going to pay for it? And that question sort of puts us in a frame where we're thinking of the federal government the way we think of a household. And we think of the government's budget the way we think of our own personal finances. The money has to come from somewhere, right? And what we're really doing is imagining that in some sense we're back on a gold standard, where you quite literally have to go out and find gold somewhere in order to be able to spend more.
So that's why people call it the magical money tree.
Well, but yeah, so Katty, that's right. Prime Minister Theresa May famously said, where do people think we're supposed to come up with the money for all of the things that they would like to have? There is no magic money tree. Well, no, there's no magic money tree, but there is a monetary system today whereby the government is the issuer of the currency. And these governments are not financially constrained the way that you and I are. So if we look at the CARES Act, which is the major piece of legislation that both houses of Congress passed and that the president signed, $2.2 trillion in coronavirus relief spending. Where did that come from? It comes from Congress authorizing that money. Those $1,200 checks that went out, that was just Congress saying to the Fed, these people are about to receive a $1,200 payment. Go make it.
And so, Stephanie, just so I make sure I hear what you're saying, you were saying that because governments can print more money, they should. We're no longer on a gold system. They should print, and they should print money in order to address poverty needs, whether that be hunger, whether that be education, whether that be healthcare. Is that what you're saying?
No. And it's important that you draw this out of me because I don't want your listeners to think that that's what MMT is about. I'm not proposing printing money. I'm explaining that the way the system already works, the way government already pays for everything, is by creating new, we could call them digital dollars.
Teva, can I ask you, when you listen to what Stephanie is describing, and I think it's important for our listeners to understand, you are in Colorado, which is in an area of America which traditionally has been fairly ferociously independent, has been fairly Republican and conservative, although it's starting to change. How do you think people in Colorado, and maybe even some of the clients that you serve in your food organization, how do you think they would feel about the idea of the kind of overhaul of the social welfare program, of the government putting a lot more money into the social welfare program that Stephanie is describing? How do you think that would go down?
On one hand, I think that many Coloradans would be open to this kind of conversation, and I think it's the conversation that we need to be having. On the other hand, I do think that Americans tend to individualize economic issues, and we tend to moralize things.
What do you mean by that?
I think that when people are in poverty, there's two basic ways of looking at that the system has failed them, or that they have failed in being good stewards of their income. And I think that we need to break down the myth around people being good stewards of their income and try to shift to thinking about these things on more of a collective level. I know that just in talking to my mom, for instance, we had a conversation about a year ago where she said to me, well, I don't understand. If most of those folks are working, why don't they just budget better? And I had to do the math with her, and we looked at what would somebody earn today on a fried chicken waitress salary, which is what she was working at the time. And could they afford a 2-bedroom house like we had at the time? And what would student loan interest rates be? And what would tuition be? And what were all of the costs that they had as parents of 2 young kids during that period of their lives? And how would the math add up? And they saw that, in fact, it just doesn't add up today. And that was a big aha for her. But I think that there's a distancing that happens psychologically in this country from the issues, and we want to blame people who are in poverty for their own circumstances rather than looking collectively at what we need to do better to ensure that we have equal opportunity in this country.
Stephanie, I was just wondering, when you hear Teva describing people like her mother who think that this is an individual issue and that it's about better budgeting, and she changed her mind after it had been explained. But when you hear that, and I've heard that too a lot, that it's somehow the kind of fault of people who are poor, and you merge that with a kind of Republican philosophy, which is we just shouldn't expand debts because that is the country's budget being exploded, and that is the country not being responsible in the way that perhaps they feel people at the bottom of the income scale are also not being responsible. Do you think it's ever going to be possible to get America to accept that it's okay to have more debt in order to try to bring people out of poverty? I just wonder if it's too big a mind shift to ask of this country.
Katty, it's a good question. And I think that to get where I'd like to see us get, which is to have both better public policy and better public policy debates, I think we have to shift the narrative. I think that there's too much trapped in that word debt, and that creates a real barrier to progress. And so what matters is the real economy, people's lives, what's happening in communities on the ground. And if we could just stay focused like a laser on setting goals and having a mission-oriented budget, make them transparent to the population, say we're putting more money in education, we're putting more money in R&D, we're putting more money in whatever program, because we want to see the poverty rate cut in half in the next 3 years. We want to see income and wealth inequality diminished by this much. Real goals, use the budget to balance the economy and stop trying to force the economy to balance the government's budget.
One of the things that people listening here will say is while they are sorry to hear about the persistent poverty, and indeed, Teva, as you're saying, the increase in it, they're also watching things like the stock market, and they're seeing the stock market seem to shoot and grow. And so for some people, there is a contradiction in their mind. Is the economy really as bad as we are saying, or is there actually more flexibility than ever before? There are more side hustles you can do. There are more opportunities to do things online. How do you respond to that, Teva? Is there a greater health, not to deny that there are problems, but is there a greater overall health to the economy?
And Teva, just before you say that, I should point out that we are speaking to a man who is sitting in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that what you're describing is what some economists are calling our K-shaped recovery, which is that those folks who are in the upper middle class, who have assets, who have stocks, who have homes, are already pulling out of this recession, and that things are looking just fine for them. Whereas for the bottom 40%, things still remain really dire and really tough. And what we know is that among the lowest wage earners, those earning, $20 or less, 4 in 10 of them lost their jobs during this thing. And an additional nearly another 30% of those folks had furloughs or incomes lost due to cutbacks on their hours or cutbacks on tips. And so those folks are still very much suffering. My hope is that through COVID, through the health portion of this crisis, I think we've come to realize that our well-beings are interconnected, that I do better if you do better, and we all do better together. And I think if we can look at an economy that is more equitable, I think that in the long term, it builds more resilience for the overall economy, and we all do better. Never mind the human level of suffering that is occurring now, and whether or not we, as a society and as a people in this wealthy country, are okay with that.
Teva, if you could think of a particular client of yours, somebody who you know who was working a job, who had been in what we might call the middle class and has fallen out of it during the pandemic, what are the one or two concrete things that people here in Washington could do if they could get their act together, which, let's face it, they don't seem to be able to do terribly much at the moment. But if something could happen in Congress that would make their lives materially better now, what would it be? What would you ask for?
Sure, and I'm going to share a mom who was working 2 jobs, one at a fast food restaurant and one in a box store prior to this, and her husband was working in construction. He has maintained some construction work, although now it's primarily in a day labor kind of a context, which is much less secure, and she has lost both of her jobs. This family was able to get that extra unemployment insurance boost of $600 for the first part of the summer. They were able to keep up on their rents. They were able to get what is called pandemic EBT, which is a little extra amount of food stamp benefits for families, just to kind of simplify it. That's kind of how I'm going to describe it. And so she was okay through the summer. But now what's happened is we haven't passed an additional relief bill, and her family are really struggling. And they need that extra boost in unemployment to continue until she's able to get jobs. They need an increase in their benefits so that they can put food on the table. And they need a Senate to start to act and to pass a new relief bill so that they can take care of their basic needs and so that they're not fearful of eviction and worried about where their next meal is going to come from as a family.
Do you think if you looked for signs of optimism, if you looked for signs that things could get better, if you gave us some hope, what would it be?
I think I get the most hope from the community in which we work. In addition to having 75,000 folks who rely on us for groceries each year, we have a community that includes about 5,000 volunteers and a number of donors. And what I've seen throughout all of this is an enhanced level of consciousness about the suffering that is going on in our community. And there's a relationship of care there for one another across difference. And I think in the U.S. we've become so isolated from one another, so siloed by socioeconomic status, by race, by religion, by political ideology. And I think that this leads to some of the disconnections that we're hearing between our public policy and the reality on the ground. And I would argue that we need to kind of do some soul searching as a country. What is it that we want for our society? What is it we want for each other and for our collective well-being? Because I think that the fact that we have such a robust third sector in this country that is so critical to providing people's basic needs every day is actually a sign of a dysfunctional economy and a dysfunctional government. And I think we need to fix the root causes and get to a place where we take better care of each other as a nation.
Teva, thank you so much for that and for your larger set of thoughts today. And Stephanie Kelton, thank you as well for joining us. I have a feeling, not a feeling, I know that this conversation is not only going to continue but intensify over the next several months, no matter who wins the election. So thank you both so much for joining us today. Katty, what did you hear? What did you learn in this conversation?
So I thought that there was something Teva said at the end there that was really interesting and I think really pertinent and draws on why there's such a difference and why this subject is so fascinating. And she talked about a robust third sector. And I'd never really heard that term before, but clearly what she means is organizations like hers, like Metro Caring that looks after 75,000 people in the Denver area. And the fact that the United States relies on that third sector, on volunteers, on people who have money giving it away, on churches, on non-profit organizations, and the fact that it's relying on them and that it's such a big sector in this country is in itself a sign of the kind of problem, right? That's the weakness in the system, that it's too arbitrary. There needs to be something that is more secure for people. And I guess that's where Stephanie's work comes in. And I don't know that you would ever get Republicans in sufficient numbers in this country to sign on to what is effectively growing the deficit, to have more of a welfare state. But there does need to be something. And I wonder whether perhaps Joe Biden, were he to be elected, having thought he was coming in as a kind of placeholder, right the ship kind of guy, actually might have to do something far more radical. Because something needs to change. You just can't have the situation that Teva's dealing with every day.
Yeah, well, you bring up several interesting notions there. I mean, one on this notion of civic organizations or the third sector. Your friend and mine, the Frenchman de Tocqueville, one of his 2 or 3 big notes on America was the early proliferation of these kinds of civic organizations, whether they were churches or the equivalent of chambers of commerce, et cetera. So it's always been there, and that's an interesting note, whether it is deeply ingrained and what that means in terms of our ability to call upon the public sector maybe to be more robust or more in the moment. Second is your notion on what a potential President Biden might do. So you're right. Sometimes people who come to positions of power seeming to be mild, middle of the road actually end up being quite interesting, transformative figures, and so maybe that could happen. If Biden were to win, he may not only be driven by his own thoughts, but by a very active left wing of the party. And if the president wins re-election, there certainly will be a significant conversation. And if Teva's right and the hunger lines are as long and continue to be that long, I think Republicans will have to and will want to engage in that conversation, maybe in a different way to deal with a different time.
Yeah, I mean, it's this kind of tension, right, that exists in the country between, on the one hand, being a country of the most generous people I've ever met and having strong principles and values about caring and looking after your neighbor. It's also one of the most Christian Western countries that I know of, right? So there's a strong religious element there too. But on the other hand, not having institutionalized in government policies to help those people. And I guess that comes from the sort of libertarian independent streak in America, that the notion that you shouldn't have to have government to do it, but people can do it for themselves or by themselves or with their community's help. I don't know that that will get resolved because of the crisis that COVID has produced, but it is certainly the case that COVID has produced a moment, and that moment isn't going anywhere, right? We know that this economy, whatever is happening on Wall Street, you're still going to have people out of jobs. You're still going to have people turning up at the food banks. And perhaps that forces a moment of change.
Yeah, well, something you're saying there is so powerful, and it ties back to what Stephanie was saying. Changing how you talk about things ultimately in part led to changing politics and policy. And now notice that people on the left are saying we need to change the way we talk
We need to change
poverty.
The way you talk about it, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because if you change the way you talk about it, you actually might end up with different things. And so we may be about to see that on the left, and that may be where some of the fire is.
But you know what? The way you start changing narratives is have conversations like this.
like this indeed.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. Please listen again next week. We're going to take a look at America's place in the world, how U.S. foreign policy has evolved during the last 4 years, and what could change after the election.